What's good, everybody? Welcome to the Big Nate Review. It's your boy Big Nate, and today, as usual, we have a dope-ass topic to discuss. Today, we are talking about the neurology of dreaming, inspired by an essay by the all-time world-class neurologist, popular science writer, Oliver Sacks. So we're going to be talking about the way in which dreams are affected by neurological disorders, the way that dreams can even anticipate the onset of actual diseases, dreaming as a form of learning, Oliver Sacks' own experience, as well as a ton of different case studies. So if this sounds dope, you already know what to do. Pop a squat and let's get straight into the video. So Oliver Sacks kicks his essay off by just pointing out the fact that dreams are oftentimes, truly reflections of our current states of both body and mind, and therefore it should not strike us as surprising at all that neurological disorders would be able to affect dreams in striking and specific ways. And Oliver Sacks says this is something that every practicing neurologist should be aware of, and yet we never question patients about their dream, and there's extremely little medical research on the topic in the field, which persists to this day. So dreams in general in the medical field, although they offer tons of valuable information, have just been written off as sort of pseudo-scientific phenomena, where really Oliver Sacks is arguing this should genuinely be part of the neurological examination because it gives us insight into the diagnosis of a patient. And as he just generally says, dreams can function as a barometer of your inner neurological health. And so Oliver Sacks talks about the first experience he has where he realizes, like, okay, there actually is this relationship between neurological disease and dreams. And he noticed it first when he was working at a migraine clinic. So first he had this observation that there was an extremely high correlation between the incidence of very intense, particularly vivid dreams or nightmares and the onset of a, severe migraine. So already he's noticing there's this very tight correlation between intense, vivid dreams and the actual manifestation of neurological symptoms. And in particular with people with migraines, they oftentimes experience a phenomenon called like migraine aura, where basically their visual field is filled with like these phosphenes, like these very almost like geometric, wavy, light-like patterns. Oliver Sacks says that this phenomenon becomes fused with and modified by the images and symbols of the dream. So what happens is you have patients who report dreams that they're experiencing this phenomenon, but they experience it as, for instance, these bright zigzag lights become in the dream a display of fireworks. Or there's another patient who has like this crazy visual stimulus, and for them it's this whole dream, and it's part of and integrated into the actual narrative, but they perceive it as an explosion of a nuclear bomb. So already we're seeing the ways in which a neurological disorder can start to interact with dreams, but in some sense this isn't too crazy yet, because this is very analogous to what happens when we're sleeping and we're sort of impinged upon some kind of external stimuli which integrates it into our own dreams. The classic example, your alarm is going off, but in the dream you're perceiving it as like, okay, we're going off in the club, that we going crazy. If your blankets are too hot or too cold, that also can oftentimes integrate into the actual narrative of your dream. And I'm reminded of an example by, he's somewhere back there, The Interpretation of Dreams by Freud. There's a person who falls asleep kind of like with their neck weird, and they have a dream that they're being guillotined. So there's tons and tons of examples of this. I'm sure we've all had our own experience, but Oliver Sacks here is describing something slightly different, where it's actually like the internal neurological symptoms themselves, right? This isn't something that's external. This is all taking place within the brain and the mind, and yet we see that it too has an effect in merging with and fusing with the phenomena of dreams. And Oliver Sacks has other patients who, for instance, have damage to the visual cortex, and he observes that there are striking deficits in visual imagery and dreaming that correspond to the brain damage. So for instance, there's one patient, he has Mr. I, who has achromatopsia, which essentially means you lose all your color vision. You can see black, white, and different shades of gray. And these people who, before the onset of the disease, were able to perfectly dream, in color, afterwards they completely lose that ability, and all their dreams take place in basically grayscale. And then we get to some really interesting cases where Oliver Sacks says if the damage in the visual cortex is diffuse enough, if there's enough brain damage to the visual cortex, visual imagery will disappear from dreams completely. And from what I gathered by Oliver Sacks and just some extra research, these people really do dream still, oftentimes in that narrative-like fashion as well, but they just rely on other senses, like touch and hearing and smell and taste. And I mean, it's hard to imagine a dream for me. It's hard for me to even get into that space, what it would look like without visual imagery. But it's showing the larger principle that, neurological disease will have like these really profound effects on dreaming itself. And the cases I find really interesting are the ones in which dreams can actually anticipate the onset of a neurological disorder. So Oliver Sacks gives an example of a woman who one night is just plagued with these terrible and vivid dreams where They all surround one central theme, that she is trapped inside an inaccessible castle, but that inaccessible castle takes the form and shape of herself. What happens is the next morning when her mom goes to wake her up, she finds out that essentially overnight this woman had become Parkinsonian and catatonic. You become totally immobile and mute and all these other things that are completely in line with the symbolic aspect. You know, she's literally trapped inside herself. She has her mind still, but she can't physically move, she can't speak. And so her dream in this case perfectly predicted the onset of the disease. He gives an example of another woman who the night before surgery has, you know, a night full of vivid dreams of particular intensity. And what happens in those dreams is she's essentially lost control of her body, right? She's swaying like wildly to and fro. Anytime she tries to pick something up, she's not able to. She can hardly feel the ground underneath her feet, you know, just complete loss of like the motion of her body. And she wakes up and she was extremely disturbed by this. She's like, I've never had a dream like this. I cannot shake it. And to Oliver Sacks's point, where the medical community does not take this seriously, her doctor wrote it off as preoperative anxiety. You know, that happens to everyone. Well, lo and behold, a few hours later, the dream essentially came true and she suffered from an acute sensory neuropathy where she no longer essentially had proprioception, which is that sensation of your body and that feeling of your body in space. And she goes on for the rest of her life. She cannot control her limbs unless she is, you know, visually looking at it, because she doesn't, you know, we can close our eyes, I can pick up this cup, take a sip of tea, and then set it back down. But the reason I can do that without any visual stimulus is because I know I have a sense of where my body is in space. This woman completely lost that. And again, it was preceded by this extremely vivid dream that, again, she explained she had nothing like it. But because dreams aren't taken seriously in the medical community, it was written off as just, you know, anxiety. But in all of these cases, Oliver Sacks says the disease must have already been affecting neural functioning. And we have to conclude that the unconscious mind, that is the dreaming mind, was more sensitive to this information than the conscious mind was. And this is an idea that goes back for time immemorial, you know, that the unconscious of the human psyche has access to certain things that the everyday waking normal mind does not. And I think it's typified perfectly by an analogy Freud makes where he compares the psyche to an iceberg, where the everyday ego, you know, normal day-to-day conscious life, that's just the tip of the iceberg. But, you know, the bulk of our psychic contents actually lies beneath that subterranean surface. Like Oliver Sacks says, their unconscious dreaming mind seemed to be more sensitive to the onset of this neurological disease than the waking mind was. Oliver Sacks also goes on to describe the phenomena of dreaming as actually a form of like neurological learning. So he talks about one experience that he had where he had a leg injury and he had been walking on 2 crutches and the doctor was like, all right, let's try and move it just to 1. He tries 2 times and he says he falls flat on his face both times. He says, I could not consciously think how to do this. What happens is he goes to sleep and he has this dream, and in that dream he just pulls up the 1 crutch and he's able to do what he could not do the previous day. He was able to do it perfectly in the dream, right? He just goes, picks it up, walks off into the sunset. Actually, it's like the medical corridor, but symbolically you see what I'm saying. What happens is he wakes up in real life and he's now able to do the thing which the previous day he was unable to do. And so he concludes in this case that the dream was not merely premonitory, but something had actually taken place. And it seems to do so through some kind of psychic rehearsal or trial or reenactment. In other words, this dream was an actual sort of form of learning. And I think many of us can relate to this experience. So I know I've had periods, for instance, one time I was trying to really learn Spanish. And while I was doing so, when I had dreams, I would always speak in Spanish. And my girl, for instance, she does martial arts. She'll have these dreams where she, some combatant comes and she ends up, practicing the moves that she had learned in her own dreams. So I know we all have experiences this. So if you have some, I'm very curious to hear in the comments. But the point of all of this is to say that there's clearly some kind of process taking place in dreams, which is a sort of mechanism of learning. So Oliver Sacks ends the essay by pointing out what Freud said, that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. And while dreams may not be a royal road to the neurologist, they do offer an unexpected byway into all types of diagnoses and insights and generally information about the patient's neurological health. And rather than just shunning these dreams as being pseudoscientific, there should be a genuinely, medical scientific investigation into the nature of the dreams and how they relate to all these neurological aspects. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Neurological Dreams by Oliver Sacks. Tons of interesting stuff. I'm sure some of you out there have experiences, so I'd love to hear about them in the comments. In the meantime, follow me on Instagram at Big Nate's Book Reviews, and thank you all so much for tuning in for yet another episode of the Big Nate Review.